Before getting into the API product space, I actually worked at enterprises. So, a lot of my focus working at API companies has been toward the enterprise. And so, through all of these kind of changes and cycles that we've gone through, a big issue that folks have to deal with in enterprise IT is how do we actually choose the software that we want to adopt? There's open source, there's commercial stuff, there's tons of vendors out there. One big way we used to do it, and a lot of folks still do, is to look at what analysts have to say, right? So we'll take a look at what analysts have said about this space over time, how things have changed, and how all of that evolves to where we are today. And then kind of talk about a framework for choosing the innovative products that we put into our own API platforms. So, as my colleague Joyce likes to say, this is just an API blah blah talk, right? There's no fancy demos that I'm going to show you of software working. If you have a responsibility for choosing software in your organization, this talk will probably be helpful to you. If you're curious about some things that are coming up, in the space, in the API management space, you'll probably find some interest here as well. So some of you folks may be familiar with this quadrant here. This is called a Magic Quadrant that Gartner puts out every year. There are several categories that Gartner has. On the y-axis here is ability to execute, and the x-axis is completeness of vision. And so everyone in the vendor space is trying to be in that top right quadrant, all the way top and to the right because it looks best. Folks all over the world look at these graphs and make decisions on how to buy software. So 2009 seems like a very long time ago, but it really is kind of the origins of how we get to API management today. At the time, we're framing this as SOA governance, right? So a lot of internal systems, SOAP, web services, WS Star, UDDI, all these kind of, all that vocabulary gets lumped into these comprehensive solutions. And, I don't need you to take a look at every name that's on this list. But what I really want you to pay attention to is how these dots are clustered on the screens as we move forward. So here we see a lot of clustering towards the center, right? So there's a convergence in functionality between these vendors. The differentiation isn't all that wide. If we move forward just 1 year, we see things are starting to shift, right? The landscape is maturing. The functionality is beginning to diverge. And if we just go one back, there is one particular name on this graph that I want you to pay attention to, and it's Sanoa Systems. They're listed as a visionary here. We move over to 2010. Things are starting to diverge. Sanoa Systems is no longer on this list. And the reason is because they are starting to notice early on that SOA governance doesn't actually define what they do. And so they're, have opted to not be in the Magic Quadrant this year. If we jump over to 2012, again, we're starting to see the landscape thin. More folks are going up and to the right. The category is being refined as time goes on, and folks are starting to realize, vendors are realizing, we actually don't belong in this category, or we're no longer part of this. And this is a response to market shifts that are happening, right? But again, tons of enterprise IT folks are looking at these graphs to make decisions, right? So let's talk a little bit about what's happening during this time and some of the changes to climate and landscape. This is something called a Wardley map. The entire presentation is just graphs, y'all. Sorry. This is something called a Wardley map. You'll see a value stream kind of going down the list here from top to bottom, and then going across, you'll see an evolution here. Is an idea or a concept in its genesis? Is it something that we're building custom in-house? Is it a product that we're buying, a SaaS product maybe? Or is it a commodity? And when we talk about commodity in IT, I mean, sure, maybe you can do utilities like power, but often it's going to be something like a cloud provider like AWS and what they offer. So at the time, kind of through this first wave here, IT has this increasing integration demand. Web services are exploding everywhere, right? Mostly SOAP. And a lot of it is kind of centralized and self-contained. So that brings up this whole idea of SOA governance and SOA management. Big comprehensive solutions that are going to try to take care of all of our service needs, discovery, lifecycle management, everything. However, through these initiatives, we're starting to realize that these services are actually providing a ton of business value, right? They're not just internal solutions. We're showing them to their different partners. We're running business off of these services. And that creates an opportunity. That creates a market shift. So we'll fast forward to 2015. They've decided to throw SOA in the garbage in terms of naming the category. And we're now over to application services governance. And for some reason, our yellow dots changed to blue. I don't know if they did like a study to say people respond better to blue dots. But I don't know. It shows up easier on a presentation, so maybe that's why. One change that we'll see here from 2010, I believe, until now, is that as we're starting to redefine this, Sonoa Systems was gone. Apigee is now on this graph. Apigee is a rebranding of Sonoa Systems, and they're in the top right. Well, why? Application services governance became this kind of hybrid of what was SOA and API management. We're starting to realize that APIs are important. And again, it's because of that shift of, hey, we're actually deriving business value out of these that's not just internal. So we'll come all the way to 2020. Gartner has realized that this is actually a whole category of full lifecycle API management, right? This isn't just a little niche part of a bigger category. It's its own thing. And so if we take a look again at the dots on the graph, huge disbursement across here, right? Like we're not seeing a whole lot of convergence happening. Maybe a little bit of clustering there from some big players. So this is really, what I call a second wave. So we know that APIs are providing value. We know that we need to continue to increase our business opportunities with those APIs because it's proving to be fruitful. It's proving to be beneficial to the business. So API management becomes the way we do that, right? However, and this took a lot of people by surprise, API usage within organizations absolutely explodes, gets so huge, largely driven by all the literature and the advice around microservices. I can tell you, being close to API management vendors, nobody was ready for this, right? Nobody had the software ready, the right model, the right deployment model. A lot was happening there. So if we jump to the latest Magic Quadrant for Gartner here, we see some folks have dropped off, right? It's thinning out again. And there are some new entrants on here, right? So Postman is now on the full lifecycle API management Magic Quadrant. SmartBear is. We have folks like Stoplight who are honorable mentions, right? Maybe they'll be there next year. And so what's happening now? What are the changes that are happening that are leading to the changes the analysts are proposing? So microservices, big explosion, right? Suddenly leads to this massive API sprawl that we've got, right? It used to be when we got started, we were telling folks why they needed an API, how that API could help them with business opportunities. Now, folks are saying we have so many APIs, we don't know what to do with them. We've got APIs that aren't being used by anybody, but we don't have visibility into that. We have APIs we don't actually know about, but people are using. All sorts of problems, consistency issues all across the board. And so what we see, this sort of traditional API management, there's many different components to it, but the API management policy enforcement, so I want to add rate limiting, I want to add spike arrest, I want to do protocol mediation, that kind of stuff is starting to move towards utility. It's moving towards commodity. If you look at something like an AWS API gateway, it does a lot of policy enforcement. It doesn't have things like a developer portal. It doesn't have really lifecycle management around it. It's very specific to that policy execution. And we see that becoming a commodity. Now, for folks who are not AWS and have been in this game for a long time, they've got these comprehensive solutions around API management that include the lifecycle pieces, that include the policy enforcement pieces. And as the market is changing, they are having, they're going to experience inertia as they have to, figure out how to take all of the legacy that they've built and move fast to respond to the market changes. And so this separation here and trying to deal with this API sprawl is creating a larger focus on the API lifecycle. And this is really going to be the heart of where we see innovative changes coming that we need to start paying attention to today. So a couple of things. The analyst reports that we look at to make decisions on buying software are lagging indicators of what's actually happening. They're not alerting you to a market shift. They're letting you know the market's already shifted. And by the time you're looking at those reports, you've already been dealing with the problems of the market shift, right? And so, right now we're seeing a stronger divergence of what's happening in the landscape. This is an API landscape diagram that we have here at Postman that we talk about. Tons of different companies on here, touches many different parts of your API lifecycle. So, there's a lot of different tooling out there. I just wanted to point out a couple of them to look at. Observability is becoming really a big part of API lifecycle management. We've got tools for designing our APIs, for ensuring consistency in those APIs, for deploying those APIs. Once they're in production, that really becomes the reality that we need to deal with. And there's typically, a drift that happens, right? Like, I had an intention to create this API. It went through development, it went through testing, and here's what it actually looks like. So one place we're seeing some innovation is in observing these things in production. So not really looking at your specification, but looking at observations of actual network traffic that's happening. And then you'll have the ability to look at that and compare it back to your design and detect that drift going forward. There's a company working on this called Akita. There's also an open source project called API Clarity. API Clarity, I think, works specifically with Kubernetes, and so it's kind of locked in that ecosystem. I think Akita will work across different deployment types. So, but again, like this area is really new, just getting started. Shift left is a buzzword, and I'm using a lot of buzzwords here. I haven't used product mindset yet, but that's also a really important one. These buzzwords, do vendors get tired of them too? Yes, we do. But there's often something like some kernel of real truth in there that's important to tease out. It's not just for selling software. So we talk about shifting left on testing. We talk about shifting left on security. I think we talk shifting left on just about everything these days. Security is a super important one. With the diverse landscape that we're seeing today, it puts a lot on folks to figure out how to wire these tools together, right? If there's not a single comprehensive solution, you've got a bunch of point solutions, maybe one that's trying to be a comprehensive solution but isn't there yet. How do we stitch them all together? Standards are typically the way to go for that. So OpenAPI is one of those standards. This company, 42Crunch, will take a look at your OpenAPI definition, which describes the structure, the shape of your API, and look for things in the OWASP top 10, API top 10, that might stick out as being security issues. So, you can run this in your CI/CD infrastructure. You can get early alerts. You can do it at design time. There's a VS Code extension. We'll start to see a lot more like this design time alerting of, not only security issues, but governance and consistency issues. So I mentioned Stoplight earlier. Stoplight would be in this sort of same phase of making sure that your design is correct and consistent with your guidelines. Detecting breaking changes. Again, open standards like OpenAPI can be used to interoperate between different tools. Folks are generating server stubs from it. They're generating clients from it, and doing all sorts of things, right? Using as a design time tool, of course. So folks are starting to develop ways to compare these OpenAPI changes over time and be able to detect if there's a breaking change. So did I have a path in V1 that I'm removing in V2? Well, if so, then that's potentially a breaking change, and we should alert on that as early as possible, typically when you check in the code, right? A couple of products here. Optic will do this. I think it's useoptic.com if it's hard to Google. And more recently, Cisco APIX Manager. I just talked to these folks. They're really getting started. Some cool stuff that they're doing there as well. With this shift, we're moving again into API Lifecycle Management, which I suspect is its own category, just waiting to burst out of the Gartner Magic Quadrant. And to really figure out what software you're going to use or how you're going to approach this, you need to define some kind of life cycle for you and what that looks like. Every model is wrong, and this is the one that we chose at Postman. You probably have one in your own organization, that you're using. One thing that I wanted to point out that is really critical when looking at API Lifecycle Management is that this is a cycle. You've got what's happening on the producer end, from defining it to deploying it, observing it, distributing that out to your consumers. How you do that distribution matters. How you have that conversation matters. Once the consumer gets it, they'll go through their process of adopting it and putting it into production. But then it's on the producer to start getting that feedback from the consumer as well, and doing that research so you can iterate for your consumer use cases. One thing we do at Postman, I work in the Open Technologies group. We work with customers to try to define an API lifecycle map. One thing I always say is that this isn't just about software. You can't just buy Postman and a bunch of other tools, and then suddenly you have a great API lifecycle and a consistent API platform internally. We've got to talk about people, process, and technology, and this API lifecycle map does just that, right? It'll list the people at the top for each phase of this lifecycle, kind of map out what's happening during those phases, and then list some of the technology under it. So this is a good practice. Sometimes we hand this document to folks, they'll go off and they'll kind of do their own, or we can work with you to get this together. But it's really a great way to see what is your internal landscape, what are your needs, and how do we start meeting them. So I've got just a couple minutes left here. I wanted to promote API Specifications Conference is coming in September. It's going to be in San Francisco. I mentioned OpenAPI. OpenAPI Initiative is a group that is hosting it, but it includes specifications like async API, JSON schema. We've got experts from all over the place coming to talk about this stuff. OpenAPI has certain special interest groups that are going to be represented there as well. So if you're interested in the standards sort of thing, come talk to us, and it's really going to be important for you, especially if you're building your own API platform that's including any number of these tools, right? Thank you. Get in touch. My Twitter handle and everywhere, really, I'm at Kevin Swiber. You can reach me, kevin.swiber@postman.com. Postman is growing and moving into some of these areas that we talked about. Eventually maybe it'll be another comprehensive solution like we used to see in the SOA governance days, and there'll be more disruption happening later. Who knows? But in the meantime, folks need help in getting this together, and we love to hear from you. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Kevin. Okay, we've got time for a couple of questions. Somebody have a question? Anybody? Certainly after that talk, there must be questions.
Nothing on innovation? No questions about AI? I didn't mention AI.
So I have a question then. So you mentioned shift left, which is a buzzword or a meme. Yeah. What about this thing called shield right? Have you heard this, and what does that mean?
Yeah, so I think when we say shift left, shield right, we usually use it in terms of security. So get your security stuff up front, and then make sure you have policies in place to catch it later, right? Like, this will happen with APIs. But I think it applies to everything. It applies to governance, design, right? You can do your design up front, have something like a Spectral, an open source project, check to make sure that your design is according to your standards, and then use something like Akita or API Clarity to say, once this is actually deployed, is it adhering to that design, right? So I think we see movement happening in both directions, and the important part is connecting those two pieces, right? The things that we're shifting left don't go all the way to the left. There's a place on the right as well, and we need to have that constant feedback loop.
Okay, any other questions? Going once, going twice. All right, thank you very much, Kevin. Thank you.
Thank you.